Hey, how you doing? I wanted to cover John Locke on peaceful parenting. It's not quite that because obviously the term didn't exist at this point, but I picked this up from Lloyd de Mouse. Lloyd de Mouse, I really think, is probably the forerunner of peaceful parenting. Maybe John Locke himself was. Of course, you have to mention Stefan Molyneux, and then I have the first published book on peaceful parenting in the world, so I do have to mention myself. But I was reading through some Lloyd de Mouse, which I do every now and then. He was a psychiatrist, and he did talk about the history of he talked about psychohistory, so how people experienced their lives over history. And so it's kind of like historical empathy in a way, what he does. And yeah, I came across this nifty passage about two-thirds of the way through this book. It's called "The History of Childhood: Untold Story of Child Abuse," and this, of course, is um, really going into the history of the Middle Ages, the pre-Renaissance, the post-Renaissance in Europe, and of course, not a lot of historical records are coming out of anywhere besides Europe, and so you just have to think, of people that can keep a historical record of how they treat their kids is like pretty advanced in and of itself. So this is a nifty book. I do like to just go back and visit the hits every now and then. There are just certain authors I like to revisit, and Lloyd de Mouse is one of them. So um, this is about two-thirds of the way through the book. It starts. However, the development of this sort of religious precocity was extreme, while the aristocratic ideal of the 17th century was moderation, which hinged on self-control. So John Locke came. His ideas were popular like right before a little bit before the American Revolution. So a lot of America is born out of John Locke, and he is not often mentioned. You hear about the founding fathers quite often. You hear about George Washington, but you don't get to hear about the philosophical underpinnings of the American Revolution. And for that, we really do have to turn to John Locke. No man better articulated this goal than John Locke, the goal being self control, whose stream of ideas on child rearing carried some sediment from the earlier part of the century, as well as the distillate of his observations as scholar and physician. In the latter category may be placed his thoughts on pregnancy and early childcare. So I'm giving you John Locke on peaceful parenting. This is from my Kindle, by the way. I'm reading this. I don't have a Kobo, what they're called. This isn't one of those daylight computers. Those are pretty nifty. When confronted with an expectant mother who was breathless following a fright, he raised questions meant to determine whether the woman suffered from cardiac failure, taxoemia of pregnancy, taxemia of pregnancy. I just skipped right through that word, or historical overbreathing. During childbirth, if the infant could not be put into natural position, quote, surgery must be at once applied to bring forth the fetus while the mother still has strength. He did not approve of swaddling. So a lot of what happened in Europe was swaddling, just putting these kids tightly bound in these slings, basically, oftentimes slings, and you'd hang them from wherever. And there are some horror stories that come out of it, like so and so swaddled their kid and left the kid hanging like on a garden gate or something, and then the wild dog pack came and ate the legs of the baby. You hear about crazy stuff like this. So swaddling first went out of style in England. And I think that comes mostly from John Locke. And of course, the last people to give up swaddling, which I think I learned earlier in this book, were the Germans. The Germans swaddled up through the 20th century. So swaddling, not really a thing. The kid doesn't really like it. It's important to have empathy for the kid. During childbirth, if the surgery, okay, so he did not approve of swaddling, noting that Spartan nurses had brought up children admirably without it. He also observed that infants on the Gold Coast at 7 or 8 months were left, quote, on the ground, so that you see them dragging themselves like kittens on four paws. This is also the reason why they walk earlier than European infants. So crawling was like out of style. Don't know if you knew this. A lot of this stuff I didn't know. Crawling was not okay in Europe for a few centuries. Unlike some of his predecessors, Locke was worried that these children would develop animalistic qualities. Was unworried, excuse me. Very important. He was unworried that they would develop animalistic qualities. He was concerned, though, that thought and care be given to raising children, believing that, quote, little or almost insensible impressions of our tender infancies have very important or lasting consequences. And we know this to be true. Most of the personalities develop by age 5. Then it crystallizes, and that's what you get. So take good care in those first 5 years. He stood somewhere between advocates of infant innocence and infant depravity, arguing that few of, quote, Adam's children were born without some bypass in their natural temper. No childhood determinist, he believed that. Quote, men's happiness or misery is most part of their own making. And his advice was generally aimed at strengthening character toward the end of self-sufficiency. Pretty cool. I mean, maybe a little ways into the way of nature, a little ways out of nature, a little ways into nurture there. Maybe a little bit further maybe I go, but maybe not. A lot of maybes. If the parent were to accomplish this task, he must from the cradle not give in to the child's will, but rather, quote, distinguish between the wants of fancy and the wants of nature. That's interesting. Locke recognized, kids are just seeking resources. I mean, so these wants of fancy, you have to put the fancy in their head first, right? Locke recognized cockering and tenderness, indulgent and corrupting practices, as an upper-class phenomenon, and exhorted gentlemen to imitate the discipline of, quote, honest farmers and substantial yeomen. To harden the children, for example, their feet should be accustomed to cold water. Poor people's children went barefoot after all. Open air and a minimum of clothing, always loose-fitting, were essential to good health. I like that, the open air. The open air is especially important, given the sanitation conditions of the day. This is pretty cutting edge, honestly. It's good stuff. Locke claimed that the, quote, the body may be made to bear almost anything. A little Spartan there, huh? But at the same time, you don't want cockering or tenderness, right? I like tenderness, right? Indulgent and corrupting practices. Okay, let's continue. A simple diet without permissive feeding was recommended. Yeah, I like that. The permissive feeding, it's like, these things are in a structure. Resources have to be doled out in some manner, some ordered, disciplined fashion, some sort of schedule. Crying was not to be indulged. And so crying is the baby just trying to help you to parent it better, right? People get all upset about crying. I'll just say, when I figured out that crying was like useful and just communication, I mean, there's no crying. There's no crying. It goes away when you learn that it's a form of communication. Long hours of sleep were to be tolerated, but on a hard bed. Quote, the great thing to be minded in education, Locke observed, was, quote, what habits you settle. And that's true. You got to lead by example. Most striking among these was, quote, going to stool regularly, to be accomplished by enforced sitting. No previous commentator had ever mentioned toilet training. That's interesting. Not a history of toilet training until John Locke. That's pretty cutting edge, man. The purpose of this regimen was to cultivate the strength and vigor of the body so that it may be able to obey and execute orders of the mind. Oh, that's kind of different. It follows logically that the virtue of the mind would be, quote, that a man is able to deny himself his own desires and purely follow what reason directs as best. Isn't that lovely? Isn't that so lovely when you reason to something and that's the best decision to make, but then in your passions, in your carnality, your desires, you're like, no, I want the other thing, and then you stick with the argument. I like that. A lot of things were built on that. Locke called for a change in current disciplinary practices. Quote, what vice can be named which parents and those about children do not season them with? Violence, revenge, and cruelty. Give me a blow that I may beat him is a lesson that most children hear every day. Threats of violence, right? As parents should not be too tender, neither should they be too hard. That's from John Locke. That's innovation right there. Oh, the Kindle flipped. The rod should be avoided as well as rewards. Yeah, rewards just cripple children's confidence, and it makes them outcome-based as opposed to purpose and argument-based. right? They always argue, like people who were raised with punish and rewards, they always argue from a fact. Shame should be the instrument used to motivate children. Quote, esteem and grace are, of all others, the most powerful incentives to the mind when once it is brought to relish them. If you can get into children a love of credit, an apprehension of shame and disgrace, you have put into them the true principle. So that's a long cry from a far cry from hellfire and damnation. Huge innovation, huge innovation. Praise and commendation for accomplishment were to be counterbalanced by a cold and neglectful countenance for failure. All right, well, not my favorite, but it was an improvement on the time. Locke recognized the limits of rules, and especially of rote learning, saw the possibilities of play. This is probably my favorite part. Quote, nothing appears to me to give children so much becoming confidence and behavior as dancing. Dance and prancing. I think it's my favorite little passage from this book thus far. I had to share it with you, right? A lot of it's really good, but it's like a lot of horror stories, And then you got to compare, right? Because in the Polynesian islands, when in the World War II, right? In the World War II, when we discovered these people, they were like burning their children alive. Okay. Let's not get into the Polynesian islands. The parenting was really effed up. Okay, let's not even go there. Okay, and emphasize the importance of parental example and a growing friendship between father and son as the boy gradually became a man. Quote, the only fence against the world is a thorough knowledge of it, into which a young gentleman should be entered by degrees. Lovely. I love it, right? The inception of childhood, the creation of childhood. Is John Locke the progenitor of childhood? Something to think about. Have you read this book, The End of Childhood by Neil Postman? Interesting book. Maybe I got to review that. Been a long time since I read that one. Not only would children be watching their parents for the proper examples of behavior, but to carry out Locke's plan, parents or tutors would have to spend a good deal of time surveilling their children. Okay, we still got some more Locke here. Nor would supervision account for all time spent, since the stricture that all children be dealt with as rational creatures could only lead to hours of explanation and persuasion. So, I mean, that's assumed, right? But it doesn't work like that. Just because you think that children should be dealt with as rational creatures, that it will lead to hours of explanation and persuasion, does not mean that that actually will happen. Just worth noting. People are going to be, some people are not going to like that very much. But the energy might be better used than formerly, since Locke took an honest and refreshingly realistic view of educational approaches to children. A little editorial there. He realized that reading first had to be encouraged for its entertainment value. Yes. Induce a love of reading, but you can't make it some sort of expectation. Strongly recommending Aesop's fables. Those are beauts. A little macabre, right? But remaining traditional enough to advocate learning the Lord's Prayer, the creeds, and the Ten Commandments. A chapter-by-chapter approach to the Bible, he noted, could only convey an odd jumble of thoughts. He approved learning foreign languages. Latin I look upon as absolutely necessary to a gentleman, he said, but was not convinced of the worth of studying English grammar. Persons of the softer sex, without the least study or knowledge of grammar, can carry them to a great degree of elegancy and politeness in their language. Oh, wait. That sounds so nice, right? That's a far cry from today. Oh, wait, that's like listening to Wouldn't It Be Nice by the Beach Boys, reading this passage from John Locke. Oh, they can show a great degree of elegancy and politeness in their language. Tell me more, John Locke. John Locke disclaimed having made a comprehensive and definitive statement on child rearing. And he made it clear that each parent must finally consult his own reason for the proper education of his child. Shout out to the decentralized bros out. Decentralized parenting. Whoa. Locke himself deviated from conventional wisdom in child rearing by changing the conditions of infancy. Swaddling clothes would be discarded, crawling might be tolerated, and though crying would not be indulged, nor feeding be so much a matter of demand, the mother would probably be present. How else would the nurse be surveilled? Because the nurses would just suffocate the children. It's nuts, man. Not so uncommon. The incidence of nurses suffocating children, like 1 in 12 or something like this. And then some of these nurses, oh, they go, oh, we're taking the baby out to the country, and then they'd come back with a different baby, and the mother wouldn't know. Bro, bad stuff. But then compared to what, right? I don't even want to go there. The early years of childhood would witness the introduction of toilet training and the discarding of corporal punishment for the inducement of shame, engendering doubt. The brother of shame, in Erik Erikson's words, was not a novelty, of course. More attention would be paid to children and the nature of their education. Okay, and this is, I think, where we leave off on John Locke in this book, anyway. For now, he's in other parts, I believe, if I recall. I picked this book up. I read like half of it, and then I've read like a sixth of it. I read a half of it like last year. So I got my notes and my highlights there. It could be worth reviewing them. I always like to review the notes and highlights when I finish a book. I think it's good reading practice. Anyway, that was John Locke on peaceful parenting. Pretty good, pretty innovative for the time. I would consider him a father of the American Revolution. I do think that a lot of the improved conditions in America over Europe had to do with John Locke, and so we owe him a great deal of gratitude. And also, I think we owe Lloyd de Mouse some deal of gratitude for his psychohistory work. I do think in many ways he is sort of the modern forebearer of this peaceful parenting movement that is just starting. And so I always mention Lloyd de Mouse with a heavy bit of gratitude. So I've gained a lot from his books, and it's always nice to sort of look back at these sources anyway. You can go and read Locke. You don't have to read Lloyd de Mouse or one of his co-writers on John Locke and get your editorials there. You can just go back and read the man himself. So I think a lot of things were better in Europe about parenting than elsewhere. And we've given up a lot of that because we gave our children over the state as early as the 1880s in America. And it started out nice, right? These frontier, like one-room schoolhouses where kids educated each other. And then we adopted the Prussian model because some idiots went over to Prussia and decided that's the way the kids need to be drilled. And now we have a lot of people that want to take command of this education apparatus and put their own stuff in there. But the medium is the message. The form of these educative processes is the education itself. John Taylor Gatto pointed out the purpose of schooling is to instill boredom in the child. So it doesn't matter what you're teaching them, as long as you're drilling them, as long as you're doing rote memorization, you're doing the bells, and you're doing the occasional emergency drills, and you're segregating by age, and you're having these teachers go through this licensure process. There is a certain something that is conveyed in that, and it's unseeable once you see it. And so we need to do it with the education system. Obviously, it would do a huge hand in us recapturing a lot of our former glory as a civilization, as a race, as a people, whatever you want to call it. All right, that's John Locke on peaceful parenting. Appreciate you being with me. If you enjoyed that, get a little cheese over to me. StephenFrancis.com/donate. I'll leave the link down below. Another one in the can. Good to be with you. Smash the thumbs up. Make sure you sub. I'll see you.